Love Letter, a romance short story by Zakira Shure. Sydney leaned against her kitchen counter, eyes focused on the half-finished letter in front of her. The words blurred together, but the emotion she was trying to capture was clear, deep, painful, and vulnerable. She sighed, pushing a loose curl behind her ear, and stared at the letter, wondering if she would ever have the courage to share it with the man it was written for, Nard. She and Nard had crossed paths at a mutual friends game night years ago. Their intentions had always been brief, never more than small talk between rounds of cards or dice. The dynamic between them was comfortable, but distant. Sydney had kept her feelings for him a secret, afraid to admit what had been quietly growing inside of her all of these years. She believed in the art of pursuit, and since Nard had never pursued her, she stayed silent, content with the way things were, or at least pretending to be. But that didn't stop her from watching him from a distance. She studied his every move, admired his quiet strength, the way he effortlessly took care of his people. Whether he was talking to friends, family, or even strangers, Nard always had an air of protectiveness about him. It was like he could sense when someone needed him, and he was always there, no questions asked. Sydney couldn't help but be drawn to him, to his steady presence, his ability to make others feel seen and valued. And good Lord, he was fine. Athletic build, milk chocolate skin, those deep waves in his hair, the way his smile didn't just touch his lips, but his entire face, leaving a trace of warmth even long after he walked away. Sydney often found herself staring when he wasn't looking, trying to hold on to the image of him before it slipped away. The funny thing was, Nard never seemed to notice, and she never let him know how much she felt, how deep her crush ran. It felt foolish, like a dream she couldn't make come true. Her feelings for him had grown over the years, and eventually, as a form of release, Sydney began writing love letters. Letters that would never be sent. Letters that she could pour all of her unspoken emotions into. Every one of her letters was inspired by one single word. Just one simple word, but one that carried so much weight. This particular letter, the one she had been working on for the past hour, had one word at its core: you. The letter, you. One word that simply carries tons of depth, meaning, and weight. My past situations have been filled with empty cycles, rooted in taking rather than giving. As I evaluate my own motives and intentions, I keep coming back to the same conclusion. The basis of my attraction for you isn't some fantasy I've created about who I want you to be, but the person you truly are. The you that I've seen from afar. The one who doesn't even realize how much of a difference he makes by just existing. I'm excited about the possibility of seeing the real you. I want to learn about your flaws so I can help nurture the parts of you that you hide. Not because I see them as a weakness, but because I know how much your strengths outweigh them. I want to bring to life the parts of you that you fear showing to the world. The parts you've hidden away in fear of being discarded or abandoned. I don't know what it is, Nard, but I believe in you. I believe in the guy who stands before me broken and strong at the same time. But more than that, I believe in the man that's aching to break free inside of you. I see it, I feel it, and maybe, just maybe, you'll see it too. Sydney closed her eyes, breathing a deep sigh. This letter, like all the others, was meant to stay hidden. Yet part of her longed to share it, to share all of them. But how could she? How could she give him the words she hadn't even said aloud? It was then that she remembered the upcoming poetry night at a local cafe, an event she had heard about for weeks. She didn't know why, but she felt this sudden pull to go. Perhaps it was the thought of getting her letters out into the world, or speaking her truth in a space where no one would know who they were really for. Later that evening, Sydney stood backstage, nervously clutching the crumpled pages of her letter. She was about to share one of her love letters on stage, knowing the vulnerability it would take to speak those words aloud, even if no one knew they were meant for Nard. She glanced into the crowd and didn't see him, but something in the pit of her stomach told her that wasn't a bad thing. Maybe she could finally release these emotions, let them float freely in the air. When her name was called, Sydney stepped up to the microphone, the lights blinding her for a moment. She cleared her throat and began to read. You, one word that carries so much depth, so much weight. In the crowd, Nard sat, leaning forward with an intensity in his gaze. He wasn't sure why, but something had compelled him to attend the poetry night. He heard about it from a friend and thought it would be a good way to spend an evening. What he didn't expect was to hear a voice so familiar, yet so vulnerable. He had never known Sydney to be this open. He'd seen her at game nights and gatherings, always confident, always in control, but there was something about her voice now, so raw, so real. As she continued reading, Nard found himself drawn into the words. She spoke of him. Even though she didn't know he was there, he could feel every word she spoke, like it was a direct message to him, a letter he had never seen but always somehow knew existed. As the night ended and Sydney made her way back to her seat, she was unaware of the man in the crowd who was just as deeply affected by her words as she had been by his. That night, Nard went home and wrote his own letter, his reply to the one Sydney had unknowingly sent him on stage. Nard's letter, you. Sydney, only if you knew how powerful your presence has been in my life. Every time I've been around you, I've been careful with how I interact with you. Guarded almost. Not because I didn't want you to see me, but because I know the moment I made my move, I would be certain that I would make you mine. I've kept my distance because I wanted to honor you. I've watched you for so long, quietly admiring the way you carry yourself, the way you move through the world with such intentions, such purpose. I've seen how careful you are with your time, who you give your attention to, and what you hold close to your heart. You never waste yourself, Sydney. You never give anything unless it's worth something. And that is rare. Every time I saw you, I knew that God had placed a treasure within you. A treasure that not only could you see, but I saw it. I saw the depths, the quiet strength, the warmth that you poured into everything around you. I saw how freely you loved the people in your life. How you give everything for them, but also how you guarded the love, kept it protected, reserved. You are the kind of woman who deserved to be fought for, to be pursued with purpose, not just someone to be taken for granted. And that's why I've waited, why I've been patient, because I knew that when the time was right, I wouldn't just want you. I'll need you to know that it was always you. It's always been you. I've dreamed about it, Sydney. Dreamed about a day where I could just be with you, where everything we've danced around, everything unspoken, will finally be put into words, where I wouldn't have to wonder whether you ever felt the same way. As I write these words, my heart is filled because I'm looking forward to the day that these words, this truth, will reach you. To the day when I can finally say them to you, not just on paper, but in the quiet spaces between us, in the look in my eyes, in the way I'll hold you close, and in the way I'll show you how much you truly mean to me. I don't need to write 1,000 letters, Sid. It's you, and it's always been you. I've just been waiting for you to see it too. Nard sat back in his chair, staring at the letter he had just written, his fingers resting on the paper. He wondered what Sydney's reaction would be, how she'd feel when she read his words. Part of him was still afraid, still unsure, but another part of him couldn't deny the pull he felt, the desire to finally break through the distance that had kept them apart for so long. He folded the letter carefully, setting it aside for now. The next step would be letting her see it, letting her know the truth that had been buried in his heart for far too long. And when the time came, he'd be ready. The night air was thick with a sense of anticipation, a quiet hum of energy vibrating beneath Sydney's skin as she walked across the familiar street towards the coffee shop where they both come to escape. It was a Sunday evening, one of those moments where everything felt both ordinary and extraordinary all at once. Sydney's mind wandered, replaying the words she'd shared on stage that night at the poetry reading. You. One word that had been etched into her heart. The letter she had shared, the letter she never intended to write, let alone share with a room full of strangers, had felt like a breakthrough. It felt like a release, like a sigh she hadn't known her soul needed to exhale. And yet something still lingered within her, unanswered. A question that had hovered in the quiet spaces between them for so long. What now? Her thoughts were broken as she approached the entrance of the coffee shop, where she froze in her tracks. There, standing against the brick wall with his hands casually stuffed in his pockets, was Nard. The same Nard she had been quietly watching from the distance for years. The same man who had somehow managed to remain just out of reach despite all of her longing. But tonight was different. Tonight, the universe felt as if it were pulling the two of them together, threading their paths with an invisible line that tugged relentlessly towards this moment. Nard turned his head at the sound of her footsteps, and their eyes locked. For a split second, neither of them moved. Sydney's heart stuttered, and for the first time, she wasn't sure if it was fear or excitement that made her pulse quicken. Nard's gaze softened, as if he had been waiting for this exact moment for far longer than he was willing to admit. "Hey, Sid." His voice was smooth, steady, so much more confident than she remembered. "Hey, Nard," she replied, her voice a little shaky, despite her best efforts to steady it. Her heart drummed in her chest, and her hands almost instinctively went to adjust her jacket, as if it would somehow make her feel more grounded. There was a beat of silence before Nard stepped forward. His tall frame seemed to fill the space between them, the air thick with the weight of unspoken words. "I didn't think I'll see you again so soon after tonight," he said, his lips curling slightly into a smile that seemed almost tentative, but it held something much deeper, something that made Sydney's chest tighten in an unfamiliar way. "I didn't expect to see you here," she admitted, surprised by the vulnerability that slipped out so easily. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," he said, his tone serious now. The playful ease in his voice was gone, replaced by something more raw, more vulnerable. "About what you said tonight, about everything." Sydney's heart skipped a beat. She felt a rush of emotions flood her chest, the same emotions she had tried to lock away in the letters she's written, in the words that had been meant for only her eyes. But here they were, in front of her, being spoken aloud. "What did I say?" she asked, her voice quiet but full of curiosity. He hesitated, then took a step closer, closing the distance between them. His eyes searched hers with a depth that made her breath hitch. "You said you," he began, "but I think you meant more than just that one word." He paused, looking down at the ground for a moment, as if gathering his courage. When he met her eyes again, she could see the rawness in them, the sincerity that couldn't be hidden. "I spent a long time keeping my distance, not because I didn't care, but because I didn't want to mess this up. I didn't want to make you feel like you weren't worth it. And I've watched you, Sid, for long enough than I like to admit. I've seen how careful you are, how protective you are of your heart, but I also know that I've been the one holding back." Sydney's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't expected him to say the very thing that had kept her locked in a prison of her own making. But here he was, saying them to her now. And it was as if the world had shifted, and all the noise around them disappeared. Nard took another step closer, closing the final gap that had kept them apart for years. "I'm not asking for everything all at once," he said, his voice lowering his words deliberately. "But I am asking for the chance to show you that I've always known it was you. It's always been you. I'm done waiting." Sydney felt the weight of his words settle into her bones, and in that moment, she realized how much she had needed to hear them, how much she had needed him to step forward, to take the initiative that she longed for but had never dared ask for. She swallowed, her throat tight with emotions, but she couldn't find the words. Nard smiled, a gentle, confident smile that made her heart skip once more. "I've got something for you," he said, reaching into his jacket pocket and pulling out an envelope. The paper was thick, crisp, and folded neatly. Sydney took it from him, feeling the weight of it in her hands. "What's this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "A letter," Nard replied simply. "For you. One I never thought I'd write, but it's yours now. Read it when you're ready, but don't take too long." His smile deepened, and for the first time, Sydney felt the truth of his words settle deep within her. "I'll read it," she promised, "when I'm ready." Nard nodded, his eyes never leaving hers, He took a step back, giving her a space to breathe, space to let the weight of the moment settle in. So, what do you say, Sydney? Want to grab a coffee with me, or maybe dinner? His eyes twinkled with mischief, but she could see the vulnerability beneath them. Sydney hesitated for a moment before answering. Yeah, dinner sounds good. She smiled, feeling the tension in her chest release as she finally allowed herself to feel the pull that had been there for so long. As they walked side by side into the coffee shop, Nard's hand brushed against hers, and for the first time, Sydney didn't pull away. In that small, simple touch, she knew they were crossing into something new, something real. And as they sat down at the table, the letter between them, unopened for now, felt like the beginning of everything they had both been afraid to say. But in that silence, in that shared moment, Sydney knew the words they had written in the quietest corner of their hearts were finally coming to life. There was no more waiting, no more wondering. This was their time, and for the first time, it felt like everything was falling into place.